In 1953, Albert Schweitzer won the Nobel Prize for Peace, and magazines and newspaper articles were calling him the greatest man in the world. But he was one of the most unlikely candidates for such accolades, having spent the majority of his life working as a doctor, tending to the poor in a remote corner of Africa.
Albert Schweitzer went to Africa, and through 2 world wars and all of the uncertainties of life, he stayed. He didn't go home, but he stayed right there, working and working and working with the African people.
In addition to being a doctor, Schweitzer was a concert organist and a respected theologian. But it was for uncovering a simple philosophy that he won the Nobel Prize. He called his way of thinking and living reverence for life.
It's a wonderful philosophy because it sounds so easy, so simple. Almost everybody can subscribe to it, whatever their faith, whatever their background, whatever their color. Almost everybody does actually revere life.
Reverence for life was an attitude, and to know Albert Schweitzer was to understand what it truly meant to revere life. When he was young, Albert Schweitzer and a friend went hiking in the countryside above their village in Alsace, then part of Germany. The boys brought along slingshots, and Schweitzer, an animal lover, was reluctantly going to hunt birds. But just as they were about to shoot, church bells began to ring out.
And when he heard that ringing, he was convinced that the bells were ringing out, "You shall not kill." And he got up and he ran toward the tree and he waved his arms to shoo the birds away and just kept on running home and never shot the birds. And he learned a lesson thereby too about the value of the lives of those birds.
The event was a turning point in the life of young Albert. He had been raised in a religious home that taught him to value all life and especially to serve humankind. Just after his 21st birthday, he made himself a secret promise. He swore that one day he would devote himself entirely to helping others.
Schweitzer always felt that he had been privileged in so many ways. He had a good education, he had all of the food and all of the comfort he could ever want in his parental home, and he felt that he had an obligation because of that to give something back to the world.
His goal was set, but how he would serve humanity, Schweitzer was not yet sure. For 10 years, he dedicated himself to his studies as a concert organist, minister, and scholar, all the while keeping an eye out for the best opportunity to be of service.
Schweitzer was casting about, wondering what he was going to do. And then one day he was paging through a magazine about Africa, and he saw an article that in Equatorial Africa, there was a need for medical missionaries. And that was the point that finally caught his attention. He would go to medical school. That would be his service. He would become a medical missionary in Africa.
Schweitzer knew that his grand plan to attend medical school and then go on to serve in Africa would not be accepted by his family. And he was right.
They thought he was going crazy. His mother was particularly furious. She said, "Oh, I brought you up. We've spent an awful lot of money on your education. You've achieved wonderful things. You could achieve many, many more wonderful things, and now you're throwing it all away. I can't forgive that."
When Albert Schweitzer made the decision to go to Africa, he knew that he was leaving a great deal behind. He was successful in music. He was well known in theology and in philosophy. And so he was going to leave all of that behind, he thought, to go off and to become nobody in Africa.
Schweitzer completed medical school, and in June of 1912, he married his longtime sweetheart, Helena Breslau. She had studied to be a nurse and joined Schweitzer in his humanitarian plan. Together, they went door to door, asking for financial support to start a hospital. The Schweitzers finally collected enough money, and their friends helped them pack a year's worth of supplies. In March of 1913, they set sail for Africa. 3 weeks and 3,000 miles later, they reached the country of French Equatorial Africa and began their 175-mile journey upriver toward the tiny village of Lambaréné. Schweitzer later recorded the moment.
River and forest. Who can really describe the first impression that they make? We seem to be dreaming. From the branch of a palm tree hang and swing 2 monkey tails. Now the owners of the tails are visible. We are really in Africa.
When the Schweitzers arrived at Lambaréné, they found themselves in one of the most undeveloped areas on the whole African continent, indeed, the world. There was no electricity and no running water. Villagers lived in thatched huts, and healers performed rituals to cast out evil spirits from the sick. There were already a handful of missionaries at Lambaréné, but someone was needed with Schweitzer's skill and determination to handle the numbers of sick. He knew what tropical diseases to expect, but Schweitzer was alarmed to find out that so many people were afflicted with more than one disease. Highest on the list were sleeping sickness, malaria, leprosy, and skin diseases. With Helena as head nurse and Albert as surgeon, the clinic opened each day to patients in need.
Well, the day began in Africa very early with the ringing of a bell to rouse people, and that day went on into the evening, and it was a day that was filled with medical considerations. It was a very busy kind of a day, and every day was like that.
Schweitzer knew how important it was to make his hospital an African hospital for Africans, not a westernized hospital that Africans would fear and avoid.
He didn't want a hospital which was all plate glass and chromium and that kind of thing. He said, that's absolutely no good to the Africans.
Schweitzer encouraged patients to be accompanied by their families, and they would cook outside of their rooms, eventually staying for weeks, months, or in the case of leprosy patients, years at a time.
Sometimes when Americans and Europeans came to visit him, they were dismayed at how dirty it was. There are animals everywhere, and there are campfires going as people are cooking their meals and so on. This is not like an American hospital or a European hospital. But that was exactly the point. It's more like an African village.
But for the patients who came to Lambaréné, diseases were sometimes the secondary health issue.
He found a very considerable amount of starvation, so that very often he would have to build up a patient before he could even start upon a cure.
Schweitzer planted a large garden along the river's edge, and the general health of the patients began to improve. He was making a difference. But the more sickness he saw, the more that Schweitzer was struck by the amount of pain that people had to bear. As a philosopher, he struggled with the possible meaning that could be found in the experience of pain and developed a new outlook about it. He viewed those who endured it as members of a special group, a clan of sufferers.
And thereafter, he said, if we understand pain, then we can reach out to our brothers and sisters when they go through pain to help them alleviate their pain.
But while the hospital at Lambaréné had become a refuge for humanity, World War I was breaking out across Europe, and it now imposed itself on the life of the clinic and on the lives of Dr. Schweitzer and his wife. Because the hospital was in a French colony and they were German citizens, on August 5, 1914, the Schweitzers were informed that they were prisoners of war.
Various soldiers came to him and said, "Doctor, I'm sorry, you've got to stop working. You're not allowed to anymore. You're going to have to be under house arrest."
It wasn't long, however, until it didn't seem to make sense to the French authorities at Lambaréné to jail the one person who could heal the sick. The rules were soon relaxed after a few months, and everyone went back to business as usual. But the thought of World War left Schweitzer deeply disturbed. From his remote vantage point in equatorial Africa, the theologian in Schweitzer was troubled by the modern world's apparent disregard for life. While he was spending his time saving lives, it seemed that much of society was doing the exact opposite and bent on destruction. His thoughts began to come together in what would be his most important work. It would be called The Decay and Restoration of Civilization. As he began to write the book, Schweitzer was searching for a universal principle that could act as a salve to society's ills, a rule to live by that might prevent war.
He was deeply disturbed, and he was looking for some other way to live. There must be a better way to live, with intelligence and thoughtfulness and reflection and with an ethically appropriate kind of life.
But Schweitzer's thoughts kept eluding him. With so many people in disagreement with each other around the world, how could there be a universal philosophy that everyone, everywhere, could understand? Then, in September of 1915, he undertook a long river journey from Lambaréné up the Ogawe River to visit the ailing wife of a missionary. Lost in thought, he struggled to find the words that would define his new philosophy.
Sheet after sheet I covered with disconnected sentences, merely to keep myself concentrated on the problem. Late on the third day, at the very moment when, at sunset, we were making our way through a herd of hippopotamuses, there flashed upon my mind, unforeseen and unsought, the phrase, "Reverence for life." The iron door had yielded. The path in the thicket had become visible.
That is the ethic. That is the phrase that he was trying to understand. The ethic of respect and reverence for all of life, human life, animal life, and plant life.
Reverence for life affords me my fundamental principle of morality, namely that good consists in maintaining, assisting, and enhancing life, and that to destroy, to harm, or to hinder life is evil.
Reverence for life is an attitude. It's not a set of rules. He said a farmer can come back from reaping the corn in his field, where he's cut down many, many swathes of corn. And that's his job, and that's okay. But if he thoughtlessly or deliberately steps on a snail on his way home, that's wrong, because that snail had a right to live. So don't do anything without being aware of the consequences and your responsibility for it. And he said that attitude will liberate you, because you'll understand that you're just a part of the great pattern of things.
Perhaps most important was that reverence for life was a working philosophy, not just an intellectual exercise. It was something that Schweitzer could apply to his work in Africa, and anyone could apply to their own lives, no matter what their religious beliefs.
He really thought that his life was his argument. He thought that what he was doing at Lambaréné, what he was doing with his patients, what he was doing with animals and plants around there was reverence for life. That was the strongest argument. That was the application of reverence for life to everyday life.
But Albert Schweitzer had barely begun to explore the profound implications of reverence for life when in 1917, as World War I entered its third devastating year, the French government ordered the Schweitzers out of Africa and sent them to an austere internment camp in Europe's Pyrenees Mountains.
And he became ill at that time. He suffered greatly. He almost died.
The Schweitzers struggled with being away from their hospital at Lambaréné, which was now sorely understaffed. Schweitzer fell into a state of depression, and Helena was in poor health. All of this, Schweitzer said, was because the world had not taken human life seriously and that it had, quote, played the fool with reverence for life. When the war finally came to an end, the despondent Schweitzers returned to French-occupied Strasbourg, where they tried to pick up the pieces of their lives.
He found himself back in Strasbourg, where he had been such a famous person. And now he wasn't famous anymore because the people he knew had all gone and people were starting from scratch. And he had no money, and he wanted to go back to the hospital and thought he never could.
Schweitzer again began to go on tour, trying to raise funds for their return to Lambaréné. He gave organ recitals, preached about his new philosophy of reverence for life, and lectured about their travels in Africa. In June of 1921, he published another book, this one about their life at Lambaréné. It was called On the Edge of the Primeval Forest, and it became an overnight success. Even though the book sales earned enough for their trip back to Africa, things had changed.
Then I came along and complicated their situation even more, because she had to look after me.
Raina Schweitzer had been born, and on top of that, Helena was suffering from tuberculosis.
My mother had had tuberculosis before she went to Lambaréné. That flared up again, and her health was really jeopardized, and that was the great tragedy in her life, to see others do what she had so much loved to do.
Although the Schweitzers had agreed that nothing was more important than the work at Lambaréné, Helena was not strong enough to make the trip.
One of the sad things about their life together is the fact that for long periods of time, she had to stay in Europe while he was in Africa, and they were apart from each other.
She realized when she married him that her life would be different from other wives, and she had promised him, and she gave him the liberty to go back to Lambaréné and to do what he loved to do.
In February of 1924, Albert Schweitzer headed again for Africa, this time alone. He arrived to find Lambaréné in shambles and set to work rebuilding it, overseeing the design and construction of new hospital wards.
He was involved in all aspects of the work. If there was building that was to be done, he was supervising the building or assisting in the building. When there was cleanup to be done, he was there. When there was supervision of the staff, he was involved in that.
Modern medicines improved the lives of the patients, and Schweitzer began 40 more years of dedication and work at the hospital. Through it all, Schweitzer managed to maintain his priorities and his sense of humor.
When somebody wanted to come as doctor or nurse, my father asked, "Do you sleep well?" And that was important. And do you have a sense of humor? That was important too. The two important things for him.
Dr. Schweitzer's sense of humor helped his staff get through the stressful days of seeing hundreds of patients and witnessing the often devastating effects of disease and illness. With the expansion of the hospital, things were busier than ever. One of his African assistants urged Schweitzer not to treat those patients who were gravely ill for fear that their deaths would tarnish the great doctor's reputation. But Schweitzer ignored the advice and held fast to his philosophy that revered all life, treating every patient who came to him. The local villagers gave Schweitzer the name Oganja, meaning healer or doctor. They marveled at his ability to heal patients through surgery and seemingly bring them back from the dead of anesthesia. As the years passed, Schweitzer got to understand his patients for the people that they were. He began to appreciate their culture and customs and gained a deep respect for them.
The Africans had a very profound moral sense. He said they may not understand many things, they may be very superstitious, they may be very cruel sometimes, but by and large, if you are to win their respect, you have to earn it. And I think they respected him in the deepest possible way too, because one of the things that they used to say about him was, this man doesn't come here to study us, he comes here to look after us. That's okay.
Although he had tremendous respect for his patients and staff, Schweitzer was also known for being brusque and sometimes intimidating.
The word paternalistic has bad connotations. And when Schweitzer was asked about this, he said to the Africans, I'm not your father, I'm your brother, but I am your older brother because I understand medicine and you don't. And that was his justification, and I think a perfectly good justification.
He's criticized as being paternalistic. He was paternalistic not only to the Africans, but to everybody who was around him and who worked for him. But he had also a tremendous amount of joy in his work and of having created his own world. He was really the center of this world and had the authority. Nobody would dispute his authority. And he was kind of a benevolent dictator. And that role suited him very well.
Despite his strong leadership, Schweitzer's warm bedside manner allowed patients to trust him, and he toured the hospital every evening, telling everyone good night. As a retreat from the daily stress that came with his many roles, Schweitzer would often entertain himself on an upright piano.
One can imagine how in the evening in Africa, the sound of Bach was coming out of that piano. And it might have been accompanied by the sound of the drums of some of the African musicians wafting over all of the jungle of Africa in that area.
Then, in the 1940s, a second, more devastating war spread throughout Europe and the Pacific. It was a war that would not end until the world's first nuclear weapon was unleashed, an event that would affect Schweitzer deeply. But Schweitzer had known all along that the best way to prove his commitment to humankind was through his work at Lambaréné, and he rededicated himself to his hospital, traveling back and forth between Europe and Africa to support it. Eventually, the public began to take a curious interest in this philosopher-doctor who dedicated himself to a life of service in such a remote place. Western publications called him the greatest man in the world, and honors from many nations were awarded to Le Grand Docteur. In December of 1953, Schweitzer was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, an acknowledgement of his lifetime of service to humanity, and a recognition of his philosophy, Reverence for Life.
It was very useful to have a Nobel Peace Prize, although he did say, I don't know why they've given this to me, and now I'm going to have to earn it. And that was when he started to look into the matter of hydrogen bombs.
By the 1950s, the world's powers found themselves gripped in a Cold War. And while Schweitzer was funneling his Nobel Peace Prize earnings back into his hospital, governments continued to put their energies into more lethal experiments, and a nuclear arms race was underway.
It seemed to him that this was the very opposite of reverence for life. This was reverence for death. And he had nothing but criticism for all nuclear testing and all nuclear weapons. He spoke out and wrote again and again against the use of any kind of nuclear force because he saw how deadly that kind of force could be.
Schweitzer was one of the first prominent figures to speak out, and his standing as a Nobel laureate encouraged a public dialogue among other scientists, adding weight to the fledgling anti-nuclear movement. He gave anti-nuclear speeches in Europe and delivered a radio broadcast around the world that he called a declaration of conscience.
We are committing a folly in thoughtlessness. We must muster the insight, the seriousness, and the courage to leave folly and face reality.
Then, in 1959, at the age of 84, Albert Schweitzer stepped down from the world stage and returned to Lamborghini, never to leave again. Helena Schweitzer died in 1957, but daughter Reina carried on the family tradition and went to Lamborghini to live and work side by side with her father.
I went there to really stay there, work there with my father. My children were growing up, and I felt that I wanted to do something there. And I thought what the hospital needed was a modern laboratory, and I could become a laboratory technician. My father first wasn't very happy about it, but I stuck to my idea and said, if you don't want me, okay, I think somebody else will give me a job. And that must have changed his mind. And the next year, he made me the chief of the laboratory.
In 1965, at the age of 90, Albert Schweitzer fell ill and took to his bed. A week later, surrounded by his family and friends, he peacefully died. At his funeral, Schweitzer's grateful patients showed their appreciation for his lifetime of devoted service, and they would continue to come for a year afterward.
When my father died, he had told me, you will see many groups of Africans coming, and they will dance and sing on my grave. And I didn't quite realize, but it was true. In the months after his death, every Sunday, one group came and they sang and they danced on his grave. I so often hear people say, oh, your father was a saint. He fortunately wasn't. He was human. He did great things. He was extraordinary, and he was always fascinating.
The hospital at Lamborghini continues treating patients and grows with each new volunteer and, tragically, with each new outbreak of disease. The legacy of Albert Schweitzer lives on.
When Albert Schweitzer was asked by people, what can we do about it? He would often say, go find your own Lamborghini. Find your place in the world where you can make a contribution. Go find that place where you can show reverence for life to some other people. Go find that place where you can be a human being among human beings. And that will be your Lamborghini.